everyone, and welcome to another episode of the In Full Bloom Book Club. Here we utilize the transformative power of storytelling to explore perspectives and to cultivate empathy, compassion, and connection. Our season questions and topics for exploration are: how does trauma shape us? What consequences of collective trauma are we facing today? And how can we support one another in navigating collective grief? We are currently reading Riding the Lightning, A Year in the Life of a New York City Paramedic by Anthony Almojera. Physical and digital book purchase options are in the description box below. This episode, we will be discussing chapters 9 through 12. There will be lots of spoilers, so go read the chapters and come back to join the discussion. And if you enjoy this kind of content and value what we're doing here, you can show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing below. So at the start of every episode, we like to do a quote of the day, and today Asia will be sharing her quote.
So my quote of the day is, "Everybody is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." That quote is by Albert Einstein. I really resonated with that quote, particularly because I tend to have perfectionistic tendencies, and I set impossible standards for myself. And it's one of those things where I've slowly been trying to work on. But yeah, that quote really hit home for me because if I'm comparing myself to if I'm trying to live up to like these impossible standards, I'm never going to achieve it, and I'm gonna feel like a failure, when in reality I'm not a failure. It's just no one can ever live up to those impossible standards. So it's just one of those friendly reminders to myself. So yeah. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read over the summary. So the summary reads, in Chapter 8, Almojera further explores some of the conflicting feelings EMS staff have as protests erupt nationwide, fighting racial injustice, especially as it pertains to law enforcement. Almojera found himself in the fight as well. And as energizing as these marches are, they are also draining, adding on to Almojera's exhaustion. From months of nonstop work to fielding concerns from stations to the loneliness that the ending of his relationship brought on, Almojera is not in a good space. And Almojera isn't the only one. EMS workers are suffering mentally, and the services meant to address it aren't enough for how expansive the need is. Fortunately, however, the cases of COVID continue to fall in New York. That isn't the case for many other places in the US, however. Almojera finds himself enraged by the state of America and what he perceives as the misinformation and ignorance that is putting so many lives at risk. To add injury to insult, potential job cuts to the EMS department demonstrate FDNY's lack of concern for the plight of the workers that they claim to stand in solidarity with. In the final chapter, Almojera discusses his reckoning with some of his trauma through various forms of therapy, the most recent of which was EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing. Even the tools he picks up from this therapy, though, doesn't stick, and he is slowly drowning. He is angry with the world, the parents who neglected him, the women who used him, and all the powers that be who don't seem concerned about the needs of their community or the first responders serving these communities. He's tired of being seemingly the only one who cares. He contemplates suicide, but finds hope in his chosen family, who he knows will make sure that he is never alone.
Okay, so our first question, per usual, is just general or overall impressions, thoughts, and remarks about this portion of the book. And feel free to give your overall thoughts about the book in general, since we are at the final portion of this novel. I'll say I'm I don't know. I was gonna wait on y'all's responses because I'm like conflicted. Obviously, we saw Anthony contemplate suicide and really go through a lot of mental health struggles. And really, feel like he was drowning in it. And at the end, there was kind of that spark of hope. But it was, I don't know. It didn't, obviously this is nonfiction. This is not like a narrative that he created, you know what I mean? So it didn't feel like the perfect, like, wrapping up with like a bow on top, and like all of the things are resolved. Because truly, like nothing was resolved really. As far as like his anger, his frustration, his loneliness, none of that was resolved. He had a sense of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. But even that felt like almost like a fleeting thought, like that got him through that moment. And I don't want to label what he's experiencing. I don't know that he would identify it as depression, or if a professional would identify it as depression. But when I've struggled with depression, yeah, sometimes it was kind of what helped me manage through this challenge, what helped me through manage through this moment, through this day, through these difficult feelings. And that's all I was able to provide in that moment. And that was enough to help me be able to experience other joyful moments, moments that weren't like uh, didn't feel like a heavy rain cloud over me. Moments where I didn't feel apathetic, moments that I didn't feel worthless or useless, or all of those other things. So I think there's a truth in that. But I think I would be lying if I said as a reader that wasn't like frustrating for me.
So my overall feelings about the book is, um, despite it being, well, it's supposed to be about like the year like 2020 and COVID, I just appreciate how it mainly focuses on stories of individuals rather than maybe like case numbers and this is what COVID is and stats and stuff like that that we know because we lived it. I appreciate that it kind of focused on stories, and I think that was a really skillful writing strategy to employ, because that, I think that kind of is what made the book so enjoyable. Just learning about the characters outside of their jobs.
Mm. Yeah, I agree, Elena. I think at the heart of this novel is connection during the time when it almost felt like we were losing that. So I think allowing that to be the thing that kind of strings a story together it was, like you said, very thoughtful and clever. I enjoyed the ending. Although it was like a shorter portion, the pacing slowed down, and I feel like we kind of were able to sit in a lot of, um, how do I say this without it sounding crazy? It was kind of like sitting in the trauma, sitting in the just after the storm, and just everything's kind of, been torn apart. I don't know, just exist in that space. And then obviously, in the epilogue, we learned that Anthony was contemplating suicide, and those feelings are so raw and so real. And personally, there are times when, like, late at night, I'm full of like I'm just anxious, and I'm having one of those like existential crises where I'm like kind of coming to terms with my mortality. It's always like late at night, right before I go to bed, that I'm always having these moments. But yeah, and like I'm anxious, and I'm needing something to kind of ground myself. And I resonate with the thoughts of, if I wasn't here, how much that would have impact the people who love me. And that's something that always brings me back when I'm spiraling, is the fact that like there is genuine love. I'm surrounded by love. Whether I notice it all the time or don't, it's there. And that's something that I feel grounds us all. It really can. So I really enjoyed this portion of the novel, and overall, I am in love with the story.
I think also to speak to kind of how I feel about the narrative altogether, um, it's such a powerful read, and I think the interconnectedness that it shows, that it demonstrates, is in part through the like stories that weave together, but also through the interconnectedness of the different departments of what's going on, like for example, what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how that impacted EMS workers,
Mhm.
or what's going on in politics and how that affected EMS workers, and how that in turn affects the community. It really speaks to kind of the collective of the trauma. I was also going to say, in addition to kind of speaking to that connection, I was having a conversation earlier with someone about the book, and I was saying, in a lot of ways, I think it's a call to action and a call to reform for EMS workers, for first responders, for blue collar workers. There's a lot of questioning, like the pandemic really was shining a light on the holes in our system, and how people are slipping through the cracks. And I appreciated this, he was, I mean, in his position as a union leader, part of his position is advocating for the workers, but still, I imagine it takes bravery to be able to say, like, I'm going to, call out people who, I may have to work with, who may be colleagues to an extent, you know what I mean? Call out politicians, and really talk about the things that are not being addressed, the needs that are not being addressed. And I really respect that level of bravery and truth and vulnerability.
All right, so we're gonna just pause right there for just a second and just want to remind you all to go ahead and please like this video, especially if you're liking what you're hearing. And if you've been following along so far, we really appreciate it. It helps move our channel forward. And also join us in this discussion. Comment down below your general impressions and answer the questions as well as we go along. So, and then also just make sure you subscribe to our channel. That'd be great, and just to be notified whenever we post more videos.
On page 202, Almojera discusses how his inability to travel during the early days of the pandemic affected him. He says, "Travel is my oxygen, and it's more than a pastime. It's part of a life that revolves around motion." Let's consider for a moment what we know about Anthony and what this quote further communicates about him and his lifestyle. So, like, when I read that part, it just tells me that like reminders of like the work he does, or like his childhood, or anything about his past feels like suffocating to him. It seems like there's a theme of him trying to separate himself from where he came from, or the work that he does being like crippling to him at certain points. And it just shows me that he would rather be places that are new and strange, where he knows no one, as opposed to being in a familiar place where there's reminders of his loneliness, because in some instances he has like his chosen family, but even that's like an iteration of like a biological family, or like it's like an alternative to a real family, as people would say. So it seems like it's easier for him to just have nothing that resembles a family or like a support system than to have a version of it that's like broken, as some people would say.
For one, I thought the way he explained his experience with kind of always being in a state of motion, I thought it was really poetic. So I just appreciated like the language that he used there. To me, I kind of, I mean, I love, Elena, the notes you're making in terms of kind of wanting this, being more comfortable with this sense of independence. And I imagine that goes back to like some trust issues, not really trusting. I agree with you. I think it can be when you have expectations of people, right? Which I think, most people have certain expectations of their family and friends. We have expectations of people to care for you or love you in a certain way, and they don't meet it. You're constantly met with disappointment. And so if you kind of free yourself of that, of have no expectations on anyone, and detach yourself from people, it can seem like a way of avoiding the pain of that. So I can really resonate with why, he would choose that if that kind of has something to do with his always staying in motion. The things that came to mind for me were one, like not wanting to like stop to think when you're kind of always in go, go, go and forward moving and
Mhm.
in a space of action and not sitting with things, and there's not as much like reflection that has to happen. And I can imagine for someone who has experienced so much trauma, reflecting can be especially difficult. And really like sitting with his thoughts, I can only imagine the places that his thoughts can go. And so I imagine that was a part of it. I also imagine that part of some of his drive growing up was doing things or being in service or in a certain way, or even I think he has mentioned before that he felt like his parents took for granted the fact that they didn't have to look over his shoulder all the time. You know what I mean? He was self-sufficient in a certain way, and he was, doing well in school and wasn't getting into things. And maybe he started to internalize that expectation from his parents. Um, and identify with it, find like pride in it. I can certainly say that there have been certain things that people have noticed about me, identified in me, and valued in me that I've then turned into a component of my personality, um, or held on to. And so I say that to say that maybe that sense of always going is how he feels valuable, how he feels useful, and has become such a large part of his identity. And then the other note I was just going to make was kind of just being familiar with a certain level of chaos, being familiar with being the fixer, that being just a comfortable space for him. So.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, so both travel and his job are parts of who he is. And I was curious to see basically what's the thing, what's similar between those two things that are a part of him, and maybe like his draw to those two things. And I think, so I thought of connection, basically being at the heart of both. So with traveling, obviously you're connecting with a different environment and a culture, and just being somewhere foreign and learning from that experience. And then obviously with his job, he's connecting with different people all the time, and um, he takes that with him. I just think that's a big part of who he is. He's always wanting to connect, but I think the way he operates in those spaces differ. I think with him at work, it's always on an adrenaline high. It's always go, go, go. And then, but after that adrenaline high is over, you're exhausted. You almost feel depleted. But then it sounds like when he's traveling, it's almost like a flow state for him. It's very natural. It feels more comfortable. So it's one of those things where both are fulfilling in its own different way, but one can feel more depleting at times and the other can kind of fill him back up, so it's this beautiful harmony between the both, that he's found that helps him.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, Asia. I'm someone who I think has, for a long time, connection has been very important to me. If I really think about the things that fill me the most, like connection's at the center of that. And I'll say for someone who desires connection so much, but for one reason or the other didn't have the opportunity or the skill set to build those growing up, I think sometimes because I had this love and this connection and this desire for connecting with humanity, but didn't know how to like cultivate certain relationships, I think it felt easier for me and maybe more fulfilling, or I don't know, maybe just easier. Like it felt like there was a pathway to connection through connecting with strangers in some way. It was short, it was temporary, like the person doesn't there's no pressure of like whether this will extend beyond this. There's none of that, but this person needs you in this moment, you know what I mean? And you're with them in their most difficult times. And there's such a depth of connection there, without the rejection that comes with relationships and cultivating friendships. And so I don't know. I feel like if I'm kind of understanding him right through his narrative, it would make sense to me that through the exploration, through travel, for example, he can feel connected with all these cultures that are outside of his own, quote unquote. But yeah, feel connected with them in a way that maybe he's not able to do with people in person because of fears or, trust issues or whatever the case may be. Hey, Tribe. Before you go, we wanted to chat with you about how you can help your fellow humans navigate collective grief and trauma. This season, each host has chosen a charity to share with you all. The charities we've selected have missions that address collective grief or trauma in some way. Our hope is that you'll find a charity whose mission aligns with your hopes for humanity.
You can check the description box for links to our fundraising pages. We encourage you all to explore the websites for information about each organization's impact and ensure you're making an informed decision when giving. InfoBloom Media has no affiliation with any of these charities or crowdfunding platforms. Thank you all for your consideration.
Journey well.